Gymnosperms are seed-bearing plants. Gymnos means naked. Sperma means seed. The ovules are not exposed by ovary wall and remain exposed. Thus, they occupy intermediate position between pteridophytes and angiosperms. Gymnosperms are the primitive seed plants.
In conifers, the same diploid sporophyte plant has both male pollen-bearing cones called microstrobili and female seed-bearing cones called megastrobili. A female cone is a modified stem bearing a tight cluster of scales, which are reduced branches specialized for reproduction. A male cone is a cluster of scales that are modified leaves inserted on an axis. Female gametophytes are produced in the megastrobili, whereas male gametophytes come from microstrobili. Megastrobili are much larger than microstrobili. The megasporangium, in which the female gametophyte will form, is enclosed in a protective layer of sporophytic tissue, the integument, that will eventually develop into the seed coat. The integument, the megasporangium inside it, and the tissue attaching it to the maternal sporophyte constitute the ovule. The megasporocyte within the megasporangium undergoes meiosis to produce 4 haploid megaspores, only one of which is functional. The non-functional megaspores degenerate, while the functional megaspore divides mitotically, and the resulting cells divide again to produce a multicellular female gametophyte. Male gametophytes develop in a similar manner. The scales of the microstrobilus contain microspore mother cells. Meiosis gives rise to haploid microspores, which in turn mature into pollen grains, the male gametophytes. The production of male gametophytes in the form of pollen grains frees the plant completely from its dependence on liquid water for fertilization. Instead of water, wind assists conifer pollen grains in their travel from the microstrobilus to the female gametophyte inside the megastrobilus. The tiny pollen grain enters through a small opening in the integument at the tip of the ovule, the micropyle. The pollen grain germinates, forming a pollen tube. When the pollen tube reaches the female gametophyte, it releases 2 sperm, one of which degenerates after the other unites with an egg. Following fertilization, the sporophyte embryo begins to develop within the ovule, while the integument, not shown, matures into the seed coat that protects the embryo. The conifer seed contains tissues from 3 generations: the diploid embryo, the haploid gametophytic tissue, which supplies nutrients for the developing embryo, and the seed coat, which develops from tissues of the sporophyte parent, the integument. The seed eventually falls to the ground and, under suitable environmental conditions, germinates to form a new pine tree.
So, as I have told you, these plants or pine plants, they grow on cold climatic conditions. They grow on mountain slopes as well as in any hilly area in upright condition. Pine trees are well differentiated into roots, stems and leaves. Stem is upright, strong, branched structures. Roots are unbranched, single and grows down in the soil. There are 2 types of
Hello students, this is Non-Flowering Plants, and today we're going to go over the pine life cycle. The pine life cycle is different from the cycad life cycle because it has siphonogamy, which means sex through a tube. There are no swimming sperm in the pine life cycle. Let's go over the overview. So we'll start with a seed. That seed then disperses. It grows up to be the trees that we all know and love. They make female cones and male cones. On the female cones, there are ovules. The male cones make pollen grains. The pollen grains get dumped in the air. They waft around a great deal. A very lucky pollen grain then lands next to an ovule, and that's called pollination. and eventually you get fertilization where the sperm nuclei are deposited next to the egg and they fuse. But pollination is separate from fertilization. And then, of course, that goes on and makes a seed, which takes some more time. Okay, so let's go in more detail. Here we have a seed. That seed disperses. It grows up to be a young sporophyte. And then years and years go by and it makes a tree, which is also a sporophyte. And it makes female strobili. And on that female strobilus, there'll be lots of ovules. If we look at one of those ovules in detail, it's on a scale. That scale is subtended by a bract. The ovule consists of an integument, and inside of the integument is the nucellus, that's nutritive tissue, and inside of the nucellus is a sporocyte. The ovule has a hole at one end called the micropyle, and the nucellus secretes a fluid through the micropyle, that pollination drop, which picks up pollen grains, and then as it shrinks, it pulls the pollen grains in through the micropyle. Let's go back to a tree, and this time we'll focus on the male strobili. The male strobili consist of a series of microsporophylls, and those microsporophylls have microsporangia on them. Each microsporangium has lots and lots of microsporocytes in them, and those microsporocytes undergo meiosis and make microspores. The microspores, of course, grow up to be microgametophytes, and the microgametophytes we call pollen grains. So pollen grain is the same as a microgametophyte. If we look at it more carefully, it has a couple prothallal cells. Those are the last vestiges of the vegetative gametophyte. There's a generative cell and a tube cell. These pollen grains blow around in the wind, and some of them end up on pollination drops, and that's called pollination. After the pollen grains are inside the micropylar chamber, then they grow pollen tubes. And here's a pollen tube. And then there's two sperm nuclei that are coming down that pollen tube, and they don't have flagellae. Now, this whole process takes quite a bit of time, and the sporocyte, the megasporocyte, has not yet undergone meiosis, so that's the next thing that will happen. It'll make 4 megaspores. Those megaspores will fade except for one, leaving a functional megaspore. That functional megaspore will then undergo lots of mitotic divisions and make a megagametophyte. The megagametophyte is the tissue of the pine nut. So here's an egg inside of a megagametophyte. There's also some neck cells. And then the pollen tubes are growing through the nucellus towards that egg. They will then release the sperm nuclei, and the sperm nuclei will fuse with the egg at fertilization, which happens sometime after pollination. That makes a zygote, and then they still have to grow a while. So the zygote is growing and growing, and it makes an embryo. And that embryo is inside of a megagametophyte, and the megagametophyte is inside of the mother sporophyte's seed coat, which has a wing in many pine trees. So it's a 2-end structure inside of a 1-end structure inside of a 2-end structure. And that is all that I have to say about that.